The wind cut through the cemetery like a blade, sharp and uninvited. She stood there, bare ankles trembling in the damp grass, one hand cradling her swollen belly as if it might protect her from the chill. 7 months along, and still she came. Because love doesn't vanish just because the person does. From the far side of the graveyard, a figure emerged. Slow-moving, deliberate. An older man dressed in a dark, expensive suit, though his feet wore tired house slippers. In one hand, he held a bouquet of white flowers, too pristine for a place like this. He stopped beside her, eyes fixed on the stone. They stood shoulder to shoulder, strangers stitched together by loss. And then he spoke, voice rough like gravel. "I'm his father, your husband's father." She walked with a kind of stubborn quiet, the wind tugging at the corners of her coat. The shoes on her feet were worn, the soles soft and uneven from months of use. Her belly, full and firm beneath the layers of cotton, swayed with every careful step. Just past the rusted gate of St. Elmo's Cemetery, she paused. Not because she wanted to, but because sometimes grief does that. It makes your legs forget how to move. Angela bent down to tighten the scarf over her ears, the cold slipping in through every crack it could find. The flowers she carried were wilting, bought for $3 at a bodega on the corner. Daisies and baby's breath, wrapped in cheap cellophane. She'd wanted white roses, something elegant, something Marcus would have liked. But dignity, she was learning, cost money. And money wasn't something she had. Row by row, she passed the polished names of people who'd lived whole lives. Some had pictures etched into their gravestones. Others had angels, poems, even benches where their loved ones could sit and talk to them. Marcus's grave didn't have a bench, or flowers, or a headstone that matched the others. Just a temporary placard that read, Marcus Whitmore, 1987, 2024. She knelt down and touched the cold metal. "I'm here, baby," she whispered. "I told you I'd come today." The wind picked up, slicing through her sleeves, but she didn't flinch. Her knees ached on the damp ground, but she stayed. Something about being near him, even under 6 feet of earth, made her feel less alone. "I brought you these," she said, placing the flowers gently beside the marker. "They're not much, I know. I promise I'll do better next time." Marcus had died 3 months ago. A freak collapse at a job site in East Harlem. The scaffolding came down fast, trapping him and 2 others. By the time rescue crews dug him out, it was already too late. The funeral had been small. A pastor from her church. 2 of his co-workers. No family. No fancy suit. Just his body wrapped in a rented casket, buried by a city voucher. Angela couldn't afford anything more. She'd sold their TV. She'd skipped meals. Still, it hadn't been enough. But Marcus wouldn't have cared. He never cared about appearances. He was kind like that. Gentle, even when his hands were calloused from lifting bricks all day. He'd always come home smelling of dust and sweat, his smile tired but warm. She could still remember the first time she saw him. Just another man in line at the 125th Street soup kitchen, offering to carry her bags when she looked ready to fall over. "You looked like you needed a friend," he'd said, and he'd become just that. They lived together in a 1-bedroom apartment with peeling paint and a leaky ceiling. Some nights they'd eat cereal for dinner and laugh like they were kings. She never asked about his family, because he never brought them up. And when she did, all he'd say was, "They wouldn't understand. You and me, that's the real life." She'd assumed maybe he came from a broken home. Maybe they'd cut him off for being poor. She never imagined anything bigger. The truth, whatever it was, had never seemed important. All that mattered was how he looked at her when he rubbed lotion into her swollen feet, how he kissed her belly every night before bed and said, "My girls, my whole world." Angela sniffled, wiping her nose with her sleeve. Her body ached in places she didn't know could hurt. She wasn't used to being alone. He used to hold her hand when they crossed the street. Now, even that felt like a memory from another life. She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a crumpled ultrasound photo. She set it beside the flowers. "She kicks a lot," she said, smiling faintly. "Just like you did when you danced around the kitchen like a fool." She laughed, but it was the kind that ends in tears, the kind that turns bitter in the throat. "You would have been such a good father." A sound behind her made her stiffen. A crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate. She turned, expecting to see a groundskeeper or another mourner. Instead, it was a man. Tall, thin, older, dressed in a gray wool coat, a suit beneath it. His shoes were clean, the kind that never touched subway steps. He held a bouquet of white roses in one gloved hand. Angela stood slowly, the muscles in her back tightening. The man stopped a few paces away, looking not at her, but at the grave. His voice, when it came, was soft, but it carried. "I didn't expect anyone else to be here today." Angela narrowed her eyes. "I could say the same." He didn't smile, didn't blink. Just stared at the placard like it might disappear if he looked hard enough. Then he said something that made her breath catch in her throat. "I'm Marcus's father." Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He glanced at her belly, the scarf, the frayed edges of her coat. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. A flicker of regret, or shame. Maybe both. "I came to say goodbye," he added. Angela felt her hands go cold. "Where were you when he needed you?" she asked quietly. The man didn't answer, just stepped closer to the grave and knelt, placing the white roses beside her dollar store bouquet. Two bouquets, two worlds, one man in the ground between them, and the wind kept blowing. "I'm not here to pass judgment," the old man said. "I came because I lost a son I never truly knew." His voice carried a softness that didn't match the sharp creases of his tailored coat. Every part of him looked like it belonged somewhere else, somewhere far from broken pavement and cheap bouquets. Angela stood still, arms across her belly, trying to measure the shape of this moment. She stared at him, her eyes narrowed against the wind. "Who are you?" He took a breath, like the answer cost him something. "My name is Raymond Whitmore." The name meant nothing to her. It sounded clean, deliberate, like something written in ink on legal paper. He watched her face for recognition and didn't find it. "Marcus was my son." Angela's stomach twisted. The baby kicked, sharp and sudden, as if responding to the tension in her body. She stepped back instinctively. "That's not funny." "I'm not joking." She looked down at the grave, then back at him, and something started to crack. Slow and bitter. Her voice trembled, not from fear but fury. "You didn't come to the funeral. You didn't help bury him. You didn't call, not once. And now you're here with roses?" "They're his favorite," Raymond said quietly. "Or at least, they were. I used to give them to his mother, before everything fell apart." He knelt again by the grave, brushing a fallen leaf off the placard, with fingers too careful to belong to someone who ever did hard work. Angela watched him like you might watch a fox come too close to the chicken coop, curious, but ready to throw a rock if needed. "I know you hate me," he said. "You probably should." She didn't answer. "I hated myself too, for a long time," he continued. "But hating yourself doesn't bring anyone back." Angela stared at the soil, her hands clenched beneath her coat. "You weren't there," she said again, slower this time. "He needed family." "I know," he said, and his voice cracked on that second word. "I begged for help," she whispered. "Do you know what it's like to beg for a proper coffin? To sit in some city office filling out forms while you're cramping and bleeding And they're telling you your husband qualifies for a basic burial? He looked down. The wind played at the edge of his coat. I didn't even know he was dead, Raymond said. Not right away. Angela almost laughed. You didn't know he was dead? He nodded, ashamed. We hadn't spoken in years. He didn't want anything to do with me. She wrapped her arms tighter across her chest. Yeah. He told me he didn't have parents. Said he was raised by his uncle in Atlanta. I asked once early on about his last name. He said he made it up. I didn't push. He wanted to disappear, Raymond said. From me. From the family name. Angela looked him over. And what name is that exactly? He hesitated, like he didn't want to say it aloud. Then finally, Whitmore Properties. We develop commercial real estate. Shopping centers, luxury condos. Maybe you've seen the signs. Her jaw tightened. You're that Whitmore? He nodded. Yes. So while Marcus was laying bricks in the rain, you were cutting ribbons in front of marble fountains? His face twitched. He didn't deny it. Angela shook her head, stepping back again. You really didn't know him? Not one bit. I tried, he said, almost to himself. But not hard enough. When he brought you home that first time, I... Wait, what? Raymond's eyes met hers. He brought you to dinner. At our house. You wore a red dress. It was raining. You'd taken a cab and didn't have an umbrella. Oh, her heart stuttered. No, that wasn't... She stopped. Remembered. One dinner years ago with a man Marcus called an old boss. A beautiful house. Candlelight. Expensive food she didn't know how to eat. And the silence. That terrible, thick silence at the table. You were him, Raymond nodded. I thought you were some distant friend. He said you gave him work once, that you were generous. He never said. He lied to protect you, Raymond said. Or maybe to protect himself. Angela stared at the ground. And after that night, she said, he said we shouldn't go back. Ever. I asked him why, and he just said, they wouldn't understand us. I thought maybe you looked down on me, but I didn't know you were his father. Raymond's voice broke. I told him to leave. I told him, if he stayed with you, I wouldn't support him. Not a dime. He called me a coward. Said he'd rather break his back than break her heart. Angela turned her face away. Tears threatened, but she held them back. He always said we were rich in other ways, she muttered. I thought it was just something poor people say. Raymond stood again, slower this time. His knees cracked with the effort. The white roses lay beside the daisies like a mistake that couldn't be undone. I was wrong, he said, so many times. I thought I was protecting him from a hard life, but what I was really protecting was my image, my ego. Angela looked up. I loved him, she said, her voice steady now. All of him, even the parts he hid. He nodded. And he loved you. That's the one thing I never doubted. They stood in silence for a long while. I don't expect forgiveness, he added quietly. But I needed you to know I failed him. And I'll carry that until the day I join him down there. Angela studied him, not with pity, but something closer to recognition. He looked older than before, not in years, but in spirit, as if grief had wrinkled something inside him that no mirror could reflect. She didn't cry, not then. She simply said, he deserved better than both of us. And for once, Raymond didn't argue. Raymond's hand trembled as he reached into the inside pocket of his coat. The movement was careful, almost ceremonial. Angela stood motionless, watching the way his fingers lingered on the folded paper, as if it carried heat, or memory, or both. I wasn't sure I should give this to you, he said, glancing at her belly, then back at the grave. But maybe it's not mine to keep anymore. He held out a single envelope, yellowed at the edges. No stamp, no address. Just a name on the front, written in Marcus's unmistakable hand. Dad. Angela took it slowly, her thumb brushing over the ink. Her chest tightened. "I found it in a box of his things," Raymond said. "After the funeral, after I finally had the nerve to ask where they'd taken his body, I didn't even know where he lived. Can you believe that?" Angela didn't respond. Her focus was fixed on the envelope. The handwriting was soft, rounded, familiar in a way that made her heart ache. "He must have written it years ago," Raymond continued. "Probably when the two of you first moved in together. But he never sent it. Maybe he thought I wouldn't read it. Maybe he thought I wouldn't care." She opened it without a word, her fingers trembling just enough to betray her stillness. The paper inside was lined, creased in the middle from being folded too long. She could hear Marcus's voice in every sentence, like he was whispering just over her shoulder. "Dear Dad, I know you probably don't want to hear from me. I get it. I made a choice and you made yours. But I wanted to say this out loud, even if I never mail it. I forgive you. I really do. I was angry, but that doesn't mean I stopped loving you. I think about you more than I want to admit." Angela's eyes blurred, but she kept reading. "The truth is, I've never been happier. Angela is... she's everything. She sees me. Not my last name, not your money, not the family business. Just me. We don't have much. Sometimes we eat ramen 3 nights in a row. Sometimes we lose electricity. But when she laughs, it feels like I'm rich in a way I never was before." Angela pressed the paper to her lips. Her shoulders hunched slightly. "I'm not coming back. Not because I hate you, but because I want to live honest. I want to build something with my own hands, even if it takes me twice as long. If I have kids, I want them to know love before they know power. I want them to know kindness before ambition. I hope one day you'll understand that this isn't rebellion. It's love. The kind you taught me once when I was little and still believed you could fix anything. I still believe people can change. Love, Marcus." Angela folded the letter back along its creases, slow and careful, like it might tear if she breathed too hard. She didn't wipe her eyes. She let the tears sit there, thick and open. "He wrote that?" she asked. Raymond nodded. "He left everything behind. I knew that. But I didn't know how much it cost him." Angela stared at the grave, her voice hollow. "He never said a word to me. Not about who you were. Not about the money. Not even that night after we left your house. Because he didn't want to burden you," Raymond said. I think he thought he had to earn your love the hard way." She looked at him, her voice shaking. He already had it. He didn't need to prove anything. Raymond nodded slowly, his mouth pressed into a line. "I failed him," he said. "I let my pride ruin what little time we had." Angela was silent. "I thought I was saving him from pain," he added. "But maybe it was my pain I was running from. The idea that my only son would choose love over legacy, it made me feel disposable." Angela's expression didn't soften, but her voice did. "You pushed him out," she said. "And he still forgave you. He loved you more than you'll ever deserve." Raymond winced, but he didn't argue. He just looked down again, hands hanging limp at his sides. "He could have had anything," she murmured, almost to herself. "A penthouse, college, a car that worked. He could have given me a ring that didn't turn my finger green." She glanced at Raymond, and for the first time there wasn't anger in her eyes. Just something hollowed out, tender and aching. "But he gave me something else," she said. "He gave me dignity. He gave me a home in a man." Raymond's throat worked to swallow. "He gave you everything he had, and never once made me feel like I owed him." They stood in the growing silence. A breeze picked up, rustling the leaves. The letter remained in her hand, cradled like something sacred. "I'll keep this," Angela said, voice hoarse, "for our daughter. So she knows her father wasn't just a man who died young." "She'll know," Raymond said. "I'll make sure of it." Angela gave him a look, sharp and wary. "Don't promise things you're not sure you can keep." "I'm not sure of anything anymore," he said, "except that I want to try." She nodded once, without warmth, but also without shutting him out. It was not an embrace, not yet. But it wasn't a door slammed shut either. Marcus's grave lay between them, still and cold, and for the first time since he died, neither of them felt completely alone. "I chose honor over fatherhood." Raymond's voice was almost swallowed by the wind. The cemetery had grown quieter as the sun dropped lower behind the trees. Angela sat now, carefully on a stone ledge near the grave, one hand resting over her belly, the other holding the letter Marcus had written. She didn't look at the old man as he spoke, but she didn't walk away either. "You ever watch a man ruin everything he's built with just a few words?" he asked, almost to himself. "Because I have. I lived it." Angela said nothing. She wasn't going to make it easier for him. "When Marcus brought you home that night, I knew the second I saw you that things would never be the same. You wore red. You smiled. You were kind, even when my wife looked at you like you'd wandered in from the wrong entrance." He let out a dry, bitter laugh. "She always had that face, even when we were young, always pretending we were better than everyone, because her grandfather owned a plantation once, and mine married into steel. You know what that buys you in certain circles?" Angela finally glanced over. "What?" He looked her straight in the eye. "Silence. Rooms full of white people pretending racism died with their grandparents, but not one of them would sit at a table with a woman like you." She narrowed her eyes. "And you didn't either." "No," he said softly. "I didn't." He pulled off his gloves and rubbed his hands together, old, veiny, trembling slightly. "You have to understand. I built everything. My father drank his way into bankruptcy. I cleaned up the wreckage, started with nothing and clawed my way into boardrooms, country clubs, political fundraisers. I didn't marry for love. I married for the last name, for leverage." He looked down at the grave. "When Marcus was born, I thought maybe I'd finally done something right. I taught him to shake hands like a man. I taught him how to dress, how to speak at dinners, how to nod at the right people." Angela's voice was low, sharp. "But you never taught him to love." He blinked. "No, I didn't." There was a long pause. The kind that stretches tight between two people when there's too much truth in the air. "The night I kicked him out," Raymond said, "it was pouring. You'd gone to the bathroom, I think. He stood in my study, dripping wet. I told him if he wanted to throw his life away, he could do it on his own dime. I said, 'Not with my money, not with my name.'" He paused, his hands balled into fists. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just looked at me and said, "You care more about people you've never met than the person who shares your blood." Angela swallowed hard. Then he walked out. "You were standing by the front door, remember? He took your hand like he'd been waiting his whole life to do it in front of me." She looked away, biting the inside of her cheek. "He never looked back," Raymond said. "And I stood there, in my $1 million house with my antique paintings and my fine rugs, and I knew I'd lost him." Angela looked at him. Her eyes weren't wet. They were sharp, controlled. "And what did you do after that? After you shut the door on your only son?" He hesitated. "I watched." "Watched?" "I had someone check in, quietly. I knew where he lived, where he worked. I saw pictures sometimes from a distance. Him pushing a grocery cart, waiting at a bus stop, holding your hand. Once I saw him helping a neighbor fix a screen door. I kept thinking, he'd get tired of it. He'd come home. But he didn't." "No. And you just kept watching?" "I was ashamed. I didn't know how to fix it." "You don't understand, Angela. In my world, weakness isn't forgiven. If I had accepted him back, accepted you, I would have lost everything. Investors, reputation. Half the damn board would have walked. Angela's voice was cold. And that mattered more than your son. Raymond didn't try to deny it. Yes, he said quietly. It did, back then. They sat in silence. Only the trees made sound now, shaking loose their last leaves of autumn. I was at the hospital, he said suddenly. The night he died. I wasn't fast enough to see him alive. But I was there, just outside the trauma room. I heard the nurse say his name, and I stood in that hallway frozen, because I realized that was it. No more chances. Angela's breath caught. I wanted to walk in, to touch his hand, to say something. But I thought, what if he doesn't want me there? What if his last memory is seeing me and remembering what I did? You should have gone in, she whispered. I know. She looked down at the grave. Her voice was tight, strained. He died alone. Raymond nodded. So did I, long before him. Angela didn't say anything for a long time. I want to hate you, she said finally. I really, really do. You should. But I can't pretend I don't see it. The cracks, the regret. I carry it with me every day, he said. She looked at him. But carrying it doesn't fix it. No, he agreed, it doesn't. Her hand moved to her belly again, slow and instinctive. He wanted to raise her different, she said. He wanted her to grow up loved, not used. Raymond nodded, slowly. Then let me help, he said. Let me do one thing right before it's too late. Angela shook her head. You can't buy your way into forgiveness. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to be better. She didn't answer. They sat there until the wind turned sharp again and the light began to die. Neither of them stood up. They were both bleeding, in their own way, beneath layers of wealth and poverty, pride and loss. And the grave between them, quiet and cold, kept the silence they no longer could. I'm an old man now, and I have no one left in this world. Raymond's voice came like a sigh, not meant for pity, but still thick with longing. His hands were in his coat pockets, not for warmth, but maybe to hide their trembling. His words didn't ask for forgiveness. They asked for space, for air between all that had been said and all that couldn't be taken back. Angela didn't answer him at first. She was still staring down at the grave, the shape of Marcus's name, the sharpness of the numbers. Her hand reached out, slow and reverent, fingers brushing the cold metal plaque like it might respond to her touch. Marcus, she whispered, you kept too many things from me. The words broke before they finished. She could feel the baby shifting, restless under her ribs. Everything inside her, her grief, her anger, her fatigue, pushed against each other like wild animals in a cage. Behind her, Raymond took a slow step closer. I know I don't deserve to ask you for anything, he said, but I want to help. Let me bring you home. My home. You and the baby. Angela turned, her jaw tightening. Don't. I'm not trying to buy you. Yes, you are. I'm trying to do something. Something Marcus would have wanted. You're carrying my grandchild. That child isn't your way back into feeling like a father, she snapped. She's not your redemption. He flinched just slightly, but he didn't step away. I can give her a future, he said. Health insurance, a safe house, education. No more cheap groceries or buses or secondhand shoes. I can make sure she never knows the kind of struggle. Angela shook her head, cutting him off. Struggle made her father who he was. You think all your money can erase what you did? What you didn't do? No, he said. But maybe it can build something new. She was silent, her breath showing in the cold. I live in a one-bedroom walk-up, she said, with a leaky ceiling and roaches that come out at night. I make a little money babysitting. Some nights I cry so hard I wake myself up. And still, I've never once wished I was someone else's wife. Raymond looked down. His shoes were too clean for that ground, too polished for grief. She's going to need more than love, he said quietly. I know, Angela answered. That's the part that keeps me up at night. She sank down slowly beside the grave again, one hand pressed against her lower back. I want to do right by her. And I want to do right by Marcus. And those two things don't always match. Raymond took a cautious step forward. Let me help you. Not to replace him, but to honor him. Angela laughed under her breath. It wasn't a joyful sound, more like something dry cracking open. You think bringing me to your mansion, feeding me fancy dinners, buying designer baby clothes, that's honoring him? No, Raymond said. But lifting some of the weight from your shoulders, that might be. She turned to him, her face worn and drawn, eyes heavy with months of no sleep and too many tears. Every time I take help from people like you, I feel like I'm giving up a piece of him, she said. Of us, what we had. I'm not asking for pieces, he said. I'm asking for a chance to carry the guilt with you, not over you. Her lips parted, then closed again. The silence between them stretched. There was no breeze now, just the stillness of early evening and the rustle of dry leaves settling into earth. He used to say we were free, she whispered, that walking away from all that money was the best decision he ever made. Raymond nodded. It was. She gave him a long, quiet look. I want to raise our daughter knowing who he really was, she said. Not just what he walked away from. You can, he said. She stood slowly, brushing the dirt from her coat. Then, with tired finality, I'm not moving into your house. I'm not letting you pay for everything and pretend it makes things better. I understand, but if she ever needs a coat in winter, or a place to go when I'm gone, maybe you'll still be around. I will be. She looked down at her stomach and exhaled. I'm not ready to forgive you, she said. But I'm not ready to shut the door either. Raymond said nothing, only nodded, slowly, as if even that was more grace than he'd expected. Then he stepped forward, toward the grave, not toward her. And without a word, he bent his knees, joints stiff and creaking, and lowered himself to the cold, uneven ground. The same man who'd once stood at podiums, shaking hands with governors, now knelt in dirt and shadows, beside the son he never learned how to love. His hand rested on the edge of the grave marker. I'm sorry, he whispered. I should have chosen you, every damn time. Angela watched him for a moment longer, her hand resting again on her belly, her back to the setting sun. And for the first time since Marcus died, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry the whole world alone. I've kept this journal all these years because I couldn't bring myself to read it all. Raymond's voice was low, almost fragile, like something he wasn't used to hearing come from himself. His hand reached into the inner lining of his coat, slow, deliberate, and pulled out a small, weathered notebook bound in soft brown leather. The edges were frayed, the spine cracked, like it had been opened and shut 100 times, and then tucked away with care no one would expect from a man like him. Angela blinked, not moving. The sun was lower now. The sky above the cemetery had turned a quiet, golden gray, like the hour was holding its breath. He held the journal out toward her. I found it in a box of Marcus's things, back when I first went looking. She took it carefully, like it might crumble in her hands. The cover was worn smooth where someone's thumb had touched it again and again. She ran her fingers over the soft grain, her breath catching in her throat. He started writing after that night, Raymond said. After I made him leave. He never mailed the letters, never called, but he wrote. About you, about life, about being scared and stubborn. Angela opened it to the first page. The ink had faded slightly but was still legible, the handwriting familiar and loose, just like Marcus's voice. Day 1. I should be angry. I should be furious. But mostly I just feel like I've jumped off a building and I'm waiting to hit the ground. Except you were there holding my hand. And I didn't fall. Not all the way. Her throat closed. She turned the page. Angela made eggs this morning, even though we didn't have bread. She kept singing to the radio like nothing in the world was broken. That kind of joy, it's contagious. Makes me feel like maybe I didn't lose everything after all. She flipped again, faster this time. I miss Dad. I miss him more than I should, considering what he said. But there's this part of me that keeps hoping he'll change his mind. That he'll show up at the door and say, I was wrong. Just once. Raymond looked away. His mouth was drawn, his eyes blinking hard. Angela continued reading, her fingers trembling on the pages. We walked to the park today. Angela saw a squirrel eating a slice of pizza and laughed so hard she almost dropped her water bottle. I love that sound. I want our kids to have that laugh, to know it. I want to give them more than I had. Not money, but something honest. Then, a date, nearly a year after they were married. I saw her cry today, after the doctor's appointment. She didn't want me to notice, but I did. It scares me how much I love her. Because what if I can't be enough? What if this life we're building collapses, and she ends up hating me for dragging her into it? Angela felt the tears rising again. Uninvited, but impossible to hold back. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and kept going. Dad, if you ever read this, if by some miracle you find this thing, I want you to know I forgive you. I don't understand you. I don't even like you most days. But I forgive you. You built a world that was too small for me, and that's okay. I'm building my own now. It's not perfect, but it's mine. And then, near the end, his handwriting had grown shakier, more rushed. If something ever happens to me, and you find her, please be kind. Please remember she's not a footnote in your legacy. She's the reason I became a man. If our child ever asks why I walked away from the Whitmore name, tell them this. I chose freedom. I chose love. I chose a woman who made me want to live honestly. Angela closed the journal abruptly, pressing it to her chest, her arms wrapped around it like it was the last piece of him left. Her whole body shook now, silent sobs pushing through as if every page had opened a wound she'd tried so hard to bandage. Raymond stood back, his hands folded in front of him, saying nothing, not interrupting, just watching, quietly, the way a man watches a tide come in, knowing there's no stopping it. I didn't know, she whispered through tears. I didn't know he was carrying all of this. He didn't want you to, Raymond said softly. He didn't want you to feel what he felt. He loved you, in ways I didn't even think were possible anymore. Angela looked up, her eyes red but fierce. He wanted so badly to make his own life, she said, to give our child something pure. And he did, Raymond said, even if it cost him everything else. She clutched the journal tighter. He died thinking he had to protect me from your world. And maybe now, Raymond said, it's your turn to protect what he left behind. Angela looked down at the grave. The flowers were starting to wilt in the cold. But somehow, they looked beautiful anyway. He wanted her to grow up free, she said. She will, Raymond promised. If you'll let me help. She didn't answer. Not yet. Her hand stayed wrapped around the journal, the leather warm from her touch, the weight of it anchored in her chest. And as the first star appeared in the twilight sky, she realized something. Love doesn't disappear when a heart stops beating. It lingers, in pages, in breath, in what we pass on. The rain came soft at first, just a whisper on the wind, tapping lightly on leaves and stones. Angela didn't flinch. Neither did Raymond. They stood shoulder to shoulder by the grave, soaked through in minutes. But no one moved. Some things you don't walk away from. The cemetery around them grew still, except for the hush of rainfall and the quiet breath of trees. It was the kind of rain that blurred edges, washed the dust from the air, and made the world feel clean for a little while. even if nothing else was. Angela had tucked Marcus's journal inside her coat, close to her chest, like a second heartbeat. The leather had already darkened from the wet. Her scarf clung to her neck, her curls heavy with water. Raymond stood beside her, water running down the lines of his face, his hands bare and open. For once, the expensive coat didn't make him look powerful, just human, smaller somehow. "Do you believe people really change?" he asked, his voice nearly drowned in the patter of rain. Angela didn't look at him. "I believe people regret." He nodded like he expected that. "I regret more than I ever thought possible." Silence again, except for the steady sound of water dripping from the cemetery trees. Then, without a word, Raymond dropped to his knees in the mud. Angela turned sharply. "What are you?" He didn't answer. Just reached out, hand trembling, and laid his palm gently against the side of her belly. His touch was light, almost afraid. "Give me a chance," he whispered, "to begin again. Not with you. I know I can't ever fix what I broke there. But with her, with my granddaughter, please." Angela froze. The rain soaked through the back of her coat, chilled her bones. But she didn't pull away. "She's not a replacement," she said, her voice breaking. "She's not your way out of guilt. I know that. And she's not a charity project either." "I don't want to save her," he said. "I want to love her, if you'll let me." For a long moment, the only answer was the sound of rain hitting his shoulders, pooling around his knees. Then Angela bent slightly, her hand resting where his lay, her skin warm against his cold fingers. "She deserves people who show up," she said, "every time, no matter how hard it gets." "I will," Raymond said, "even if I have to stand in the rain forever." Angela's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't planned to cry again. But something in her chest cracked open, a space she didn't even realize she'd closed. The tears came quiet, mingling with the rain. She didn't sob, just let it fall. Her chin trembled, her shoulders shook, and still she didn't say a word. Instead, she nodded, a tiny motion, barely there, but it was everything. Raymond pressed his eyes shut, the kind of shut that holds in years of silence. He bowed his head, whether from reverence or shame or prayer, she couldn't tell. Angela stepped back, wiping her eyes with the edge of her sleeve. Her voice came low and hoarse. "You can walk with me," she said. "That's all I'm promising right now." He looked up. His face was streaked with water and something else, something fragile. "I'll take it," he whispered, gratefully. Then, from somewhere behind them, came the sound of rubber soles on wet gravel. A woman with a kind face, the cemetery groundskeeper maybe, walked toward them. She held out a large black umbrella, worn and slightly frayed at the corners. "Looks like you two could use this," she said gently. Angela took it with both hands. She opened it slowly, the metal ribs unfolding with a soft click, and lifted it high enough to cover them both. She held it steady over her own head, over Raymond, and, without thinking, angled it just slightly forward, so the rain wouldn't hit the grave. Under that small black canopy stood 3 lives, one gone, one growing, and one too old to start over, but desperate to try. For a moment, the rain quieted, as if the sky too had paused. They stood like that for a long time, not healed, not whole, but under the same umbrella, for once. The house never heard the sound of a baby before. Not until today. Raymond said it almost in a whisper, as if the walls themselves might be listening. He stood in the middle of the nursery, painted soft cream, the light from the wide window slanting across a pale yellow blanket draped over the crib. In his arms, the newborn girl shifted in sleep, her tiny hands curled like commas near her cheeks. He rocked her slowly, knees bent slightly, tears already slipping down his face. No one told him it would feel like this. That a baby no bigger than a Sunday roast could weigh more than all the business meetings, real estate deals, and regrets in the world. Angela stood in the doorway, her hospital bracelet still around her wrist, her body stiff with healing. She was tired. God, she was tired. But something inside her was beginning to soften. Not forget, but open. I didn't expect to cry, Raymond murmured. But here I am. Angela stepped into the room. She's got his chin. He nodded, brushing a fingertip gently down the baby's face. And your nose. No, she doesn't. Trust me, he smiled. She absolutely does. Angela laughed quietly. The sound startled her, as if she'd forgotten her own voice. It had been 6 months since that day in the rain. Since the cemetery. Since the journal. She hadn't moved into the mansion. That hadn't changed. But she'd allowed him to come by, to help paint the nursery, to drive her to appointments, to carry groceries when her back couldn't take the weight anymore. He never tried to replace Marcus, never asked too many questions, just showed up. That's what earned him the right to hold her daughter today. I never knew a child could bring so much silence, he said. Angela tilted her head. You mean peace? I mean everything else disappears when she's breathing like that. Angela walked to the crib, peered in at the sleeping girl. She doesn't have a name yet. He looked up, surprised. You're still deciding? I wanted to wait until she arrived. I wanted to see her. They were quiet for a moment. She looks like a lily to me, Raymond said. Angela blinked. I used to say that name out loud when I was alone, she said. When I'd talk to her through my belly. Lily. I never told anyone that. Well, he smiled, voice thick. Maybe she was listening. Angela sat down in the rocker by the window, exhaling slowly. The cushion creaked beneath her, a sound that felt soft and honest. A mother's sound. I kept his picture, she said, next to my bed. Good. He never got to see her face. But I hope, wherever he is, he knows we're okay. I think he does. Angela looked at Raymond. Really looked. He was older now, more fragile than he'd been in the cemetery. He moved slower, paused more often. But his eyes, those hadn't changed. They were the same eyes as Marcus's when he used to stare at her belly, full of some hope too big for words. You remind me of him, she said softly. Raymond's breath caught. That's the first time you've said that. I know. He crossed the room slowly, laid the baby in the crib, and pulled the blanket up over her small frame. Then he turned to Angela, hands folded in front of him, like he wasn't sure what to do with them anymore. Thank you, he said. For what? For letting me try. Angela didn't respond right away. She reached down and touched her daughter's tiny toes through the blanket. This life, she said, isn't the one I dreamed of. But it's real. And it's full. He nodded. I still wish I could undo what I did. I don't, she said, because then we might not have ended up here. Raymond's eyes shimmered. So, you forgive me? Angela shook her head slowly. No, not yet, he swallowed. But I'm not living in the past anymore, she added. I'm walking towards something, and you're here. That's what matters. Outside the window, birds gathered on a branch, wings slick with morning dew. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang once. Angela stood, kissed her daughter's forehead, then turned to Raymond. I don't forgive the past, she said, but I'm opening the door to the future. Raymond smiled quietly, like he understood what that cost her. Then I'll be on the other side, waiting. As they stood there, the baby stirred in her sleep, a tiny coo escaping her lips like a promise whispered into the stillness. And for the first time, the Whitmore house didn't feel cold. It didn't feel like regret. It felt like something waiting to bloom. Angela took one last look at the room before stepping into the hall, her voice low and even. If you've ever been turned away because of who you love, she said, or where you come from, or the color of your skin, don't forget, courage and forgiveness can tear through any wall. Raymond followed behind her, slowly, quietly, like a man relearning the sound of life. We'll see you again in our next story, where another quiet moment might hold a powerful lesson. If this one moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next truth waiting to be told.